I've been teasing for a time that there are certain bits and pieces that I need to do a dive through the history books for. There was either a mini explosion of something that appeared, or just a pattern developing somewhere. And long-time viewers of this series will be aware that I can be talking about something, mention something and go, actually, that's one to talk about later because that could be interesting. The only problem is, over the last few years, I've completely neglected to write any of them down, so yeah, if you're a die-hard viewer of these videos and you can remember some of the ones that I've said that I haven't done yet, could you write them down for me? Please? Go on, be a pal. And to be honest, for me, this is a format that works out pretty well. For the long-time viewers who have been around since the beginning, those videos were something in the region of about, 15 to 20 minutes and were titled The Full Story Of, where basically everything that happened was included. But since the big reformat of late 2020 into 2021, it's better that I split those longer videos up into multiple videos where I can devote 15 minutes or so to a specific event within that full story video. If you follow me. Take the 1994 season as an example. I did a video on that years back called Complacency Leads to Disaster or something like that, and that was a trip through the entire 1994 season. But out of that, there's now videos on Schumacher's disqualification from Silverstone that has its own dedicated video. There's the plank debacle at Spa, Verstappen's pit lane fire, the death of Roland Ratzenberger, Simtech, and the Option 13 debate. So that's basically what's happening here today. I did a video at some point last year where I talked about the T- sponsor that Arrows had, and that kind of kick-started the downfall of the team, among other things as well, because the Tom Walkinshaw management and this and this and this and this and this. But before TWR came along and took over the team, there was the red, white and blue of Footwork. But who exactly were Arrows? It was a team that was effectively a spin-off of the Shadow team that had existed in the 1970s. This is the team that Tom Price was driving for at the 1977 South African Grand Prix, so if you've heard the name before, that's probably where you've heard it. And you've heard it for all the wrong reasons. In 1977, Franco Ambrosio, Alan Rees, Jackie Oliver, Dave Wass and Tony Southgate left Shadow and they formed their own team, and they managed to get a car on the grid for the start of the 1978 season, which was a turnaround of just 3 months. There you go, Andretti, no excuses now. That's a joke, by the way. The name Arrows was a mashup of all the surnames of the guys involved in the setup of that team. The only thing they did was add an extra R. The way they came up with the name was similar to how March and Cosworth had done before them, with Alan Rees being a part of March when that was set up. Again, it's mental how all this connects. But they had a bit of a shaky start. At the beginning of 1978, Ambrosio was sent to prison for financial irregularities. Then one of their drivers, Gunnar Nilsson, had to leave the team because he was starting cancer treatment. And then a bit later on after that, Shadow, from which Arrows was a spin-off from, sued Arrows for copyright infringement because the Arrows car that was being run looked eerily similar to the Shadow car. I'll leave you to be the judge of that. Here's a picture of the FA1. I'll leave it up for a couple of seconds just for you to have a scan over how it looks. And then here's the DN9 Shadow. Yep, they're the same. Arrows was anticipating that the court would find in favour of Shadow, so they designed and built a whole new car in just 50 days. Just in case. By the mid-1980s, only Oliver and Rees were the only original founders left. I don't know how long Ambrosio was in prison for, but it looks like he never went back to the team. Southgate had a falling out with the others and went to work with Tom Walkinshaw, while Wass went to Benetton, partly due to being late arriving as British Aerospace had trouble with the carbon monocoque design and their BMW engine was underpowered versus the ones that Brabham and Benetton had got. Yes, the same BMW inline-4 turbocharged engines that had 997 million horsepower, or whatever clickbait figure people are pulling out their asses this week. By the late 1980s, the turbos were being phased out, and in 1989, Ross Brawn designed the A11. Eddie Cheever had managed to get a podium at Phoenix, and Derek Warwick in the other car had led the Canadian Grand Prix for a bit before his engine expired, as well as being in contention for a win in Brazil before a long pit stop ended that dream. Arrows had been 5th in 1988, but dropped to 7th in 89. But they were hovering around the midfield and scoring decent points between 87 and 89. 1990 though was an absolute disaster. They were using an upgraded version of the 1989 car and for whatever reason things had just not gone to plan, either because the upgrades hadn't worked or everybody else around them had just, outdeveloped them. I'll leave it to you to decide which way it went. Was it one, the other, or both? It was probably both. So, enter Wataru Ohashi, a Japanese businessman. Through 1990, Ohashi had been investing in the Arrows team, much like the takeover at March by Akira Akagi, which had also happened in time for the start of the 1990 season, and it's a period I covered in its own dedicated video. There is probably a way of making a graphic that shows how every single one of these videos is somehow connected, I'm sure. There's probably some connections you wouldn't have thought of. Ohashi was born on the 12th of October 1947, and the only information I can find on the guy was correct as of the 1st of January 2017. He had originally worked for a transportation company called Nihon Unso in the 1970s, and between then and around 1981, he'd worked his way up to the top and overseen several mergers. Apparently 7 more logistics companies were merged into Nihon Onsu, which translates roughly to Japan Transportation, and by the mid-1980s this had been formed into a larger brand. Footwork. Now I'll be straight with you, as a kid I thought Footwork was a shoe company or just the name of the team, which is why I was a bit confused when they changed the name into Arrows, because before my time they were called Arrows and I knew them as Footwork. It's a bit like going into Foot Locker and finding out that they sell cosmetics. I mean, they probably do. I've never been inside a Foot Locker. But anyhow, Footwork had become big enough that by the late 80s or so, they were sponsoring Japanese driver Aguri Suzuki through Formula 3000, which is Formula 2 today, and the business had expanded into restaurants, construction, bars and other stuff across Japan, Hong Kong, the UK and the US. As was often the case back then, the next step was Formula 1. For 1991, Arrows was rebranded Footwork Arrows, and they had a new car and a new engine. The new car was powered by a Porsche, and it wasn't particularly good. Porsche is a name that's quite high up on the list of cars with a racing pedigree. The famous Nobody's Perfect advert from 83, 84, the utter dominance in Group C, the GT3 stuff, GTE stuff, the 919 LMP1 and the Penske Porsches that destroyed Can-Am so hard that Porsche and an oil crisis basically ended that series entirely. It's why whenever anybody says let them run what they want, I go, yeah, because that worked out great for Can-Am, didn't it? But anyway, Porsche had been in Formula 1 before as a factory team and as an engine supplier. They had won the championship with tag branded engines in the McLarens in 1984 and 1985, and they were endurance racing royalty. The engine they brought to Formula 1 this time was the 3512. It was a V12 engine, a 3.5 litre V12 engine, 3512, 3.5 litre 12. Porsche was putting their own name on it this time because in the past they were worried that if the engine was rubbish it would sully their brand, but now they felt confident enough to brand it properly, if you follow. But the engine was a disaster. It was underpowered, heavy, and the oil pressure was through the roof. On top of this, Porsche's engine was being crammed into a car that was an update of the previous year's car, and that car was designed for a Ford V8. So here's the deal then. They used the V12 crammed into the V8 base car for the first round in Phoenix and the second round at Interlagos, with Alex Caffey getting the first FA12 at Imola, a car actually designed for the V12. Now Caffey didn't qualify for Imola or Monaco while Alboreto retired from the 3 races he had the FA12 for. Caffey was then injured in a car crash and was replaced by Stefan Johansson, who retired at Montreal and then didn't qualify in Mexico. The Porsches were dumped for the rest of the season, with the team reverting to the Ford DFR, an evolution of the DFV, for the remainder of that season. The engine never saw a checkered flag and failed to qualify 5 times in 6 attempts. Porsche hasn't been back since. For 1992 though, it was just business. Aguri Suzuki arrived, and thanks to his Japanese ties he brought with him Mugan Honda engines. Honda as a factory engine supplier was gone, but Mugan was in the sport instead. The engines were the 1990 spec engines that Tyrrell had been using, but were still decent enough to score a couple of points finishes. Alboreto took the newer, more conventional FA13 to 4 points finishes, a 5th at Spain and Imola, and a 6th in Brazil and Portugal. Now 6 points sounds like nothing today, but given only the top 6 scored, it was a good haul for a team of Footwork stature, and they equalled the well-connected Ligier team in 7th. Derek Warwick would return to the team in 1993, and the year wasn't great except for a 6th at Silverstone and a 4th place at Hungary that left them in 9th overall. Due to the poor results and the Footwork organisation tight on cash thanks to the Japanese recession, Ohashi pulled the Footwork sponsorship, although he remained as a shareholder and the team retained the name for 1994 and onwards. But because Ohashi had pulled the funding and there was a shortage of cash, it meant that Suzuki was gone, and so were the Mugan engines. 1994's car was a glass cannon. It had decent pace, and the two young drivers in Christian Fittipaldi and Gianni Morbidelli showed promise. But without Ohashi's funding, the money was tight. But Fittipaldi was fourth at AIDA, which would have been great for the Japanese-backed team because, as already mentioned, Ohashi still retained his shares. Fittipaldi was on course for a third at Monaco before his gearbox failed. But Footwork was knocked back a peg or two because they were just about to get on top with the problems that were plaguing their car. But then the FIA forced all the teams to make radical changes as part of the knee-jerk safety overhaul that was part of the reaction to the San Marino Grand Prix. The team finished 9th that year. They were able to get a double point score at the German Grand Prix where only 8 drivers finished. Part of the reason for that being that most of the drivers were wiped out by Hakkinen at the start. Then Morbidelli managed to get a 6th place finish and a solitary point following the Michaels disqualification from the Belgian Grand Prix as part of Plankgate. Footwork had a base with which to improve, but much like the other teams we've looked at, even though this isn't so much a downfall video, they just didn't have the money with which to get on with things. So for 1995 things were looking bleak. So bleak that the team had to rely on paid drivers for its survival. The first of these was Taki Inui, a man who had a short but incredibly eventful career in Formula 1. And yes, I do need to do a video on the time he got run over by the medical car. Morbidelli was kept on and he would score a point at the Canadian Grand Prix, but the season was peppered with pink for Inui, as his car didn't seem to want to finish a race, either because it was blowing up or because he was destroying it. At the British Grand Prix, Footwork brought in the original Mad Max Papis, someone who had quite the career on the other side of the Atlantic. He got the name because at the 1996 Daytona 24, he unlapped himself from the leader and was almost in contention for a win by smashing in fastest laps, despite having a beaten up car. He's also one of the nicest people in the world, by the way. I was in a Discord voice channel with him once and he recognised my name and went, "Hang on, Aidan Millward? Man, you were f***ing hauling ass in that race earlier." Which is just an indication of how insane all that lockdown racing was back in 2020, and that was 4 years ago, if you can believe that, but you know, we all missed a couple of years, didn't we? But either way, he's also Emerson Fittipaldi's son-in-law, and he was part of the Kart Brat Pack, which was him, Greg Moore, Dario Franchitti, and Tony Kanaan. But Max didn't get along with Formula 1. He couldn't get his head around the car, and he didn't care much for the politics and how much money was required to race versus other series around the world. His luck didn't help him either. He had suspension failure at his debut at Silverstone, he was left stranded on the grid at Hockenheim, and then at Monza, he spun on dust dumped onto the track by David Coulthard and caused a pile-up. He took the restart and just missed out on points because Jean-Christophe Bouillon overtook him in the closing stages. Morbidelli was back for the Pacific Grand Prix, with Papis only finishing 2 of the 7 races he did. Morbidelli would retire from the Pacific and Japanese Grand Prix but would take a 3rd place at the chaotic Australian Grand Prix, which is a video I need to do because it seemed that nobody wanted to finish that race. The 3rd place that he got was the best result for the Footwork team, despite Damon Hill getting a 2nd place at the 1997 Hungarian Grand Prix. But at the end of the year, Rees and Oliver managed to buy back the shares from Ohashi, but only the name remained. In the March of 1996, things were changing again. Tom Walkinshaw arrived and bought out 40% of the team, which was Alan Rees's share, and the team would be TWR Arrows later on during the 1996 season, although it had to remain as Footwork until at least the start of 1997 because of rules regarding changing your name mid-season. If you follow me with that, it's quite a mouthful. I've done a few takes of this bit. But 1996 as a whole was, well, largely anonymous. Jos Verstappen would score just the 1 point for the team at the Argentine Grand Prix, or Argentinian Grand Prix, but he had shown some insane speed at the preceding Brazilian Grand Prix, where he held the fastest lap at one point in a race that just would not have started today. As was often the case with teams like Footwork in these days, a sea of retirements. Part of this was because Tom was full focus on 1997, Bridgestone tyres, Yamaha engines, and later on in the season the acquisition of Damon Hill. Verstappen had shown how good the car could have been, but this was now a transitional year. The retirements the car suffered were scary on occasion, Verstappen slamming hard into the tyre wall at Stavelot during the Belgian Grand Prix when the throttle jammed open, which left him with permanent neck injuries. With Damon on the way for 1997 and Pedro Diniz signed up to help pay Damon's wages, Verstappen and Rosset were moved on. Jos would go to Tyrrell and Rosset would go to Lola, albeit briefly. Footwork's time in Formula 1 ended with 9th in the standings with that one solitary point, the only 2 teams behind them being Minardi and Forti. So from 1997 onwards, it was back to being Arrows. TWR Arrows specifically. So what happened afterwards then? Well, Arrows continued under its new ownership and had a storied history, which I've covered with the whole T-minus thing that kind of kick-started the downfall of Arrows. Rees went to Stewart and Oliver stayed on until the end of 1999 when he sold the rest of his shares that he had to Walkinshaw. In 2001, the Japan Times reported that Footwork and 2 of its affiliate companies were filing for court protection, using a recently passed law that helps companies in Japan get protection from the courts when they enter money troubles. I guess a bit like how administration works over here. It was reported that Footwork had opened this case in the Osaka District Court under the Civil Rehabilitation Law, where they cited debts of 171.8 billion yen, which is around £870 million. That's in 2024 money, by the way. It's probably less eye-watering in 2001 money. Footwork Express had claimed that it was owed equivalent to £91 million by Footwork International, and in turn Footwork Express was something like 125 million quid in the hole. The economic downturn in Japan at the start of the 90s had made the Footwork shareholders tell Ohashi to stop funding racing and focus on the company, but there was now also competition coming in from other courier and parcel companies. At some point in 2001, the company went under completely, and then Ohashi and 5 others were arrested and charged with fraud, as they were allegedly trying to fiddle the business figures through the 90s to make it look like they were making more or losing less than they actually were, and then using those fudged figures to acquire bank loans. Those indicted were Ohashi, his vice president Shunji Kuroda, managing director Hiroyuki Matsumoto, and at least 2 others, although the Kyoto News states that it was 3 others for a total of 6. That same news outlet said that they'd fudged the figures to show they'd made pre-tax profits of 465 million yen in 97, 2 billion in 98, and 600 million in 1999, but it had actually lost 10 billion, 9 billion, and 5 billion yen in those same respective years. But I found some extra information after I dug up that picture of the Footwork delivery van that looked like it was quite recent. In 2004, Kyushu Sanko Transport Company became the owners of Footwork Express's parent company, and in 2009 that was bought out by Toll, the Australian logistics company. In 2012, it became Toll Express Japan. And then after some more moving around bits and pieces like that, Japan Post and Toll are now the co-owners of this Kyushu Sanko company, and then in 2023, it became JP Logistics. Almost a year after those arrests in 2002, Arrows folded, which is poetic, ironic, it's whatever you want to call it really. I don't really know what the right word is to use, but Arrow's demise was also a myriad of other things as well, which, I've covered. But it just shows just how mad the 90s was for these kind of takeovers and how some of these business deals went down back then. But it is kind of sad in a way, because Arrows was one of those teams that a lot of people liked, mostly because they ended up being orange for a couple of years. So then, a look at the not-so-fancy footwork involved with managing Arrows in the 1990s. If this video has been interesting for you, then do like it so I know a good job was done, and for more deep dives into the motorsport history books, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help out at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks down there if you want to buy me a coffee or a pint, and there's also memberships if you want to be a bit more overt with your support. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.